a reason why you're here?
It's fun to be here.
It's fun to be here. Awesome answer. So far I've been having a blast. What makes it fun for you?
Well, the people, the environment, the ideas, no particular order.
So is the environment, the idea, the people, is that different than your normal day-to-day? Or do you just have this much fun all the time and you're bringing it with you?
It's different from the normal day.
How so?
Well, these days, everything for me is virtual. I work remotely from everything. And my housemate and cats are great, don't get me wrong. But, I wouldn't trade them for anything. But there's, even with my working team, it's not as exciting. It's a working team to have the day job. And very little time is exploring topics like this, which is super interesting for a lot of reasons. That makes it fun for me. That's different.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for that, Justin. I appreciate you saying so. A lot of the things that we talk about at places like Dent seem like add-ons. They seem like the elective classes that we get to take after we're done with our real homework. I'm going to make a different argument here today. I'm going to say that not only is this integral to what we do all day long, every single day, but that you've actually been doing it the whole time. And what we're really here for is to give a little structure, a little handrails to this so that you can repeat it, get better at it, replicate it elsewhere, so that it doesn't feel like coming to Dent is such an aberration. Yes, we have feet. Yes, we're sharing nonverbal energy and it's different than being online. But wouldn't it be nice if we were surrounded in our workplace and our other systems with curious, innovative people who were thinking and feeling and looking at things in different ways that challenged us? Yeah. Learning is all about changing our minds, which is actually fairly easy to do unless you're in a political conversation about the president or whatever. That aside, there's a continuum of what's difficult to change. If we were in a different kind of a workshop, I'd pass out a piece of paper and ask you to write trust on it. I'm sure you've done something like this, and then crumple it up or rip it, and then say, okay, now make it back the way it was. Trust doesn't really work that way. But we're going to come back to that metaphor at the very end. So if you'd hang on to that somewhere in your thinking, I'd be grateful. But I'm also going to make this easier for you. Because instead of just saying things like, hang on to this in your thinking, what I'm going to invite you to do, and a lot of you are already on our community online, is curate. Take notes, take pictures, and guess what? You can do this all conference long. The French have this wonderful phrase, and I don't speak French, so forgive my pronunciation, but l'esprit de l'escalier. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Anybody want to translate what I just butchered? It's the idea at the bottom of the stairs. All of us have wonderful ideas, but, and I heard Brandon earlier talking about mold in the house. I had black mold once too, and the intervention team came and they took out a closet. And I said, that's great, but what about this carpet? Well, we're not here for that. How did the mold know to stop? In school, in our formal education, which you'll hear me crack on a little bit later, 1 hour for algebra. But now I got to scrub that, and now I've got to think in Spanish. Now I've got to scrub that, and now I've got to think in geometry. You're going to have an idea after we leave. L'esprit de l'escalier. When that idea comes up, go back on our community. Or if you have a question that didn't get asked, find me anytime. If you're in a different talk and it makes you think of something you thought here, or something that you could have added, we're not going anywhere online. We're still there. That's going to go on for as long as we want it to, even after the physical conference in Santa Fe is over, depending on how we're feeling about it. So changing our minds, fairly easy. Having asynchronous communication and online stuff to augment what we do in life, pretty familiar to most of us. Trust, a little bit more irrevocable, but here's a big one. Mr. Hand was wrong. I wrote a book on time way back when. My doctoral research was all about how people perceive and use time, both for their individual growth and also their organizational development. And I had a personal interest. My best friend, all through my childhood, passed away our summer after our senior year of high school. And all of a sudden, time was like, tomorrow was promised to no one, and I took a big interest in it. You get 86,400 seconds a day. Every single time I walked into a room and I said something about time, someone would go, oh, time, right, time management. No, not time management. Do you guys know the comedian Stephen Wright? The real deadpan guy who everybody took like 3 seconds later to laugh at his jokes because they weren't really sure he was kidding. He said, yeah, I bought a microwave fireplace so I could sit in front of the fire for the evening in 6 minutes. Anytime you find yourself making the activity so efficient that you can get it over with, I mean, if you're trying to get out of the kiss quickly, it's probably the wrong person. So one of the things that I want us to be mindful about is I feel a lot of trust from you because this is the one ultimate irrevocability. You can replace money, you can change your mind back to where it came from, you can rebuild trust in a relationship, but we only get one crack at 10 to 12 on September 10, 2023, and then we're 2 hours closer to the ends of our lives. Let me just put that fine point on it. This is a big responsibility. I got to make this valuable. Yeah. Does anybody remember opportunity cost when you were in econ? Okay, I see some nods. What does opportunity cost?
What it's costing me to be doing this as opposed to all the other options at my disposal.
Okay, what it's costing me to be doing this, all the other options at your disposal. Did I get that right? Practicing reflective listening, right? That's nearly perfect. But what Ward didn't say is that it's the sum total of all of those possibilities. So, like I said, Schrodinger's chat, you could have been in kayaking the Bering Strait. You could have been on the moon. You could have been doing all of those things with all of those people anywhere in the world. And it's the sum total of all of that that you're sacrificing for this. Have I made anybody want to leave yet? So I take that personally because to me, that means I need to be at least that valuable. So when we talk about adult learning, you all know what this is. We build these really wonderfully intricate schema, these categories in our mind, the way that we think. But we also have to unlearn a lot to get out of our own way. Kids don't have this problem. Everybody has a 5-year-old in their lives somewhere. And what do 5-year-olds do?
Ask questions.
Bing, 100 times a day at least. And as we get older, we get influenced out of this. Now, I have not changed at all. And that's partly what got me into this. So at breakfast, a few of us were talking, and I was teaching at UCLA. I was running a management consulting firm, pretty happy doing those things. And a friend of mine wanted to start a nonprofit. And the nonprofit was teaching middle school and high school students about the environment by having them go out and clean it. So Bologna Creek in Marina del Rey, the trails in the Angeles Crest National Forest. And he brought me as, academic window dressing to these meetings. Well, one of the principals said, you researchers are adorable, because you have no idea what happens on school grounds the days that we don't give tours. And through some fit of, I was having some embedded anthropological fantasy about I was going to go and get the real story behind things, I decided to go teach. And what I found did not match my impressions. Now, I'm going to touch on a lot of things today, and this is open. So when I talk about open source learning, I didn't give it the name because of open source software, although it was convenient because a lot of people were talking about that in the early 2000s when I did this. I did it with the idea of systems in mind. Right now, if someone comes into the room and they come in loudly enough, it'll change the dynamic. It may even change the conversation. It'll definitely make us feel observed in a different way. School is a very closed system, and closed systems have a half-life. Justin and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. At some point, a closed system will give way to being stale or just out-and-out entropy. In the case of school, we can see that the culture has moved on, the technology has moved on, the economy has moved on, even our physical environment has changed so much. School's still teaching the Bohr model of the atom, and the teacher still has to be in a room that looks a lot like this, and only one of us gets to stand up. So when I say open, yes, perfect.
I'm sorry, but in what sense does that static.
Wonderful. That's exactly what I was trying to say. So if I came across the other way, beautiful. Thank you, Evan. No, I'm saying that school is a closed system that has stayed the same, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But our learning environments, by necessity at this point, function best when they're open. And just now was a perfect example, so thank you. I brought that up because when I put this slide on, it reminded me of cognitive dissonance and Leon Fessinger's work around that in the 50s and 60s. I'm going to mention a lot of that stuff for two reasons. First, it'll give us invitations, so if you hear something you're interested in but I move on, feel free to do what Evan just did. The second thing, though, is that I'm going to curate this after the fact. Part of the reason that we're doing this on video is because we're going to make a micro course out of this, and I'm going to put that on the same community where we've been doing everything else. The whole idea is, on the one hand, you're the studio audience for the televised version, but really, every part of our lives is curatable. And what I was totally not prepared for when I came back to teach high school was that nobody was using the public internet. This was 2004, 2005. And I looked around and I thought, you've got access to all of it, all the information, all those people. What are we doing? So I started putting students on the public internet, and everybody asked me if I was worried about getting fired. And because I didn't really want to be there in the first place, I wasn't. But I was an anomaly, and I had to give it a name. Does anyone know anything about cognitive dissonance? Is the term familiar? You may or may not know this, but ideas have about 3 ways of interacting. An idea can follow from a previous idea. An idea can be completely disconnected, as in, first, I'm hungry, therefore I should go get food. That's consonance. Disconnected is, I'm hungry. That's a lovely dress. Disconnected. Cognitive dissonance is when I'm confronted with 2 things where the following idea flows from the opposite of the first idea, and that creates conflict. When I experience that conflict, I immediately feel a desire to resolve the conflict. That desire is so strong that it rivals thirst, hunger, and sex. And we don't use it nearly enough. What we do is we prune. When we're infants, everything is infinitely interesting because it's all brand new. And at that point, our neural architecture is like an upside-down bowl of spaghetti worth of connections. Over time, if you think of each one of those as a pathway, some of those paths we walk more than others. Some of those paths, by necessity, become habituated patterns. They become neural highways. We need to travel those more frequently and more efficiently, and other things we just kind of let go. So when I teach, and I'm teaching people who speak Spanish, I have to admit, hay muchas palabras en español que no me recuerdo porque no practico bastante. I don't remember a lot of words in Spanish because I don't practice enough. I try and carry that one off, though, because I want them to follow my bluff a little bit. But the truth is, I don't speak Spanish every day, and so it's not as easy for me, and I don't dream in Spanish, I don't think in Spanish. That's how I know I'm not fluent. I put this image up, though, for another reason. Because when you look at this image, you see a vase or you see 2 faces? Yeah? You see the faces? It's almost impossible to see them both at the same time. Now, I say almost impossible because it gets more possible if you actually do something. If you trace this image, if you had this on a piece of paper in front of you, and you trace the image, it would become possible. And I'd like to give you another quickie example of how I integrate this stuff. If you pick your left or your right arm, and put it out as far behind you and horizontal as you can, go ahead and do the exercise. Now, feel the stretch through here as far as you can possibly go. But now, turn your head and look over your shoulder and move it back a little further. It's like magic. Did you feel what just happened? That's because in the visual cortex of your neural architecture, your brain was getting a signal that it wasn't getting before. The beauty of that is that you could consciously control the signal and therefore influence what you were capable of doing. Now, here's the thing. We talk a lot about learning, but then we raise veal for the rodeo. Learning is not passive. Learning is an absolute, it's a demanding endurance sport. And it drives me slightly nuts when people say, oh, so open source learning, what is it? It's that thing you've been doing your whole life. Then I'll get more to that, but what it isn't is a commodity, something we buy off the shelf, or something we sit in a room and get taught, like, oh, so that's what I do now. We've all learned about visualization. Visualization is valuable. We just talked about the visual cortex. But doing something is the magic here. There's no substitute for the action. In fact, if anybody, if you follow inspirational speakers like Anthony Robbins or all these endurance sport guys like David Goggins, they'll tell you, and the one piece of wisdom here is, doing the uncomfortable thing now makes everything easier later. So we were talking about team building earlier, and I mentioned John Wooden. And Coach would spend a lot of time talking with me, but not about basketball. Abraham Lincoln, poetry. One of his favorite authors was Grantland Rice, who used to write a sports column in verse. And one of his favorite verses was The Champions. And it went like this. You watch to see them do it. You look to see the knack. You watch the hand in motion, or the shoulder, or the back. But as you climb up higher on that laurel-covered spire to where the higher glories lurk, you'll find that the most of it is practice, and the rest of it is work. So yes, visualizing what we want to accomplish in this session, super important. But let's keep it simple. Out of all the things I talk about, grab onto a couple. No more than 3, even, for starters. And make that your practice through the rest of the conference, whether it's curating something on our community, whether it's learning how to do a skill tactically, or whether it's describing it to somebody who isn't here. But then do that thing.
Question.
Yes?
Can we go back to that slide just for a second? So you kept, when you were saying, like visualizing, I'm trying to understand simplify, select, act, describe. I'm trying to place those 4 and I'm having a little trouble.
Okay.
Could you just run me through what those words specifically, how they relate?
Yeah. So anybody ever play golf? It's a brutal, horrible sport. I just got invited to network playing golf. I haven't picked up a golf club in 20 years, so I wanted to say yes, he's a good friend, and I took a lesson. And everything was wrong. The way I was holding the club was wrong. I was moving wrong. That was too much for me. So simplify. Where are my hands? Just that one thing. And simplify and select are very closely related, right? So when I said pick 1 or 2, 3 things tops, that's what I was aiming at.
Kind of like focus, simplify, and select?
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about focus in a little bit. And feel free, if I didn't answer that as completely as you'd like, to come back to it. All right. We're going to do this for a moment, but only a moment, because I want to get to some other good stuff too. When we talk about belief and trust, we get pretty quickly into controversy and perspective, because in our culture, we have managed to take reality and splinter it into a lot of mediated realities, and there's a lot of opportunity for disagreement. So, as opposed to getting into the what can I believe, which I do hope we'll have ample time to talk about during the conference, did anybody get to the point where they were asking a question? I know, Justin, you talked about team building. Was there anybody else who got to that point? Because I didn't see too much traffic on that part of the community.
This morning.
Yeah, what did you come up with?
What you suggested was to go in and kind of let it be visual.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did that, I thought, well, I just want to learn how to collaborate with spirit and earth and humans to create good stuff. Like that's overall what I want to learn. And then what popped to mind was I also want to learn tribal belly dance.
Fantastic.
So that's kind of like the big picture and the little one.
Awesome. Anybody else? And I'm going to keep these examples and come back to them in a little bit. Evan, what do you really want to learn? If time, money was no object, what would you just want to learn just because?
To be happy.
Beautiful. Me too. When you figure that one out, can we please chat?
But I don't expect to figure it out.
A lot of wisdom in that. Everybody I ask that question takes that pause because we're not trained for that moment. When I started teaching and I was in a high school classroom and I asked that question, at first I was impatient because my thinking was, I'm giving you the freedom, like, what's taking so? And I realized atrophy. From that 5-year-old, why, to, yeah,
Can I say something about that?
please.
I do something called human design, and the majority of people are responsive to yes and no. So
Mhm.
when you ask somebody an open question like that, it can be very difficult for most of the people that respond to, oh, this, I see that, yes, I want that, or I don't want that.
Yeah. In fact, asking an open-ended question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Em.
Well, I was going to say, I can tell you that part of the internal process is breaking an enormous number of possibilities very quickly down into a few. When I took my MBA, the general rule was, if you're at a fair selling jam, put 6 on the table. Don't put 12, don't put 18, don't put 24, put 6, because 6 is a number people can handle choosing from. You just gave me an entire universe to choose from.
Right.
It took a moment.
Yeah, and by the way, not for nothing, but that's that opportunity cost nibble. It's like, well, I didn't choose a major at UCLA until they made me. Dan?
I almost did raise my hand because I'm here with you, and I'm like, I want to give space to everything. One of the things I want out of life and here is to learn why other people learn and to take, selfishly, knowledge from other people. When you talk about happiness, that I +1, that one, I always viewed it as like a planet you can get close to in orbit but never land on. And that's how I kind of look at happiness. I love that you brought it up because that brought that up with me. So that's what I want, is just knowledge.
Yeah. And to come back to what you said about the open-ended question, I just listened to a talk from an FBI hostage negotiator who responded. Yeah. And he talks about the open-ended question as a way to put people back on their heels because we're really not prepared for that moment. To translate that into moments that we are prepared for. 20th century, we had Waldorf, Montessori, Reggio Emilia. We had alternative education constructs. We really don't in the 21st century. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and sell you open source learning as this is what we should do, but I do think we ought to be considering the fact that here we are squarely in the information age with no information age philosophy to account for how people learn, interact, communicate, share reality, do stuff together. And so one of the things, if I start at the bottom, that I am very interested in is helping us redesign. If we're really going to dent the future, I mean, that's the level that I would love to see that happen. I've got kids. I know some of you do as well. I look at the world that they're encountering now as teenagers, and I imagine how that might have been for my friends and me, and that would have been a disaster. So going up one rung from that at the organizational level, how we build teams, how we interact with each other, the kinds of norms that we adopt and create a corporate culture with or create a system of collaboration around, those are all very intentional things. And at breakfast we were talking, and Justin, you told me that a professor had said, well, it's either going to happen or it's not. That's wrong. It's going to happen or it's not is a fatalistic construct, and you could say, well, oh sure, it's a 1 or a 0 at the end of the day, fine. But from here to there is quite a journey. And all of the things that we do to influence the garden's performance, the irrigation, the sunlight, the nutritious soil, the kind words, why bother if it's just going to happen or it's not? So the building blocks for the organizational and institutional effect, again, if you're looking to do something like that, and you know, before you got here I said that I went to law school for one day, And that was the extent of it. And I'm looking at Ward because I know your background a little bit. But looking at an institution or an environment and thinking, we can do better, we can do different. Well, that's every relationship I've ever seen. Management, family. And that brings us to the group. How we are at the dinner table, how we were at breakfast this morning. Every single thing I do in the day, now I can't consciously moderate how I breathe all day. I'd be exhausted. You know, what do I believe? I believe that when I get out of bed that the floor won't give way and I won't go into the earth's core. That's helpful. But there are a lot of things that I do intentionally. In the beginning of this talk, I decided to spend a few more minutes on the AV and a few more minutes on the description and kind of blow up my own timeline because I really didn't know exactly where I was going to start and what I was going to touch on because this is such a rich buffet, which is why I was so grateful that some of you joined me for breakfast so I could get to know you a little bit and find out what was important to you. Back to that value question. And then, of course, why does, in our culture, the big emphasis on learning is probably the least important for me, but it's valuable. How do we learn? How do we get to that point in our lives where we go, oh yeah, well now I'm doing that thing that I set out to do and I feel good about it. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the things we have in common. Now, this morning's banana conversation notwithstanding, I do this on a variety of surfaces around my house just because it amuses me. It started with an angel Christmas tree ornament and construction paper, and I'm a vandal in my own home. But that goes to our capacity for story. Language, not unique. You listen to birds in the trees this morning, big deal. Lots of animals do it. In fact, lots of people do it. And lots of people invent jargon to keep their community smaller and more exclusive. But what people do that other animals don't is we think in abstractions and we tell stories. So how did we manage to organize in ways? There were 7 other hominid species. That's why I put Harari's book front and center. What happened to the Neanderthals or Homo erectus or? Well, they didn't do what we do. They couldn't organize in numbers greater than 150, the Dunbar number, because they were limited by language. If you wear a UCLA sweatshirt anywhere in the world, you may run into some Trojan fans, but people are going to know what it means. If you go into a church anywhere in the world, doesn't matter what language is being spoken, the rituals are going to be shared. If you look at a map, that's not real. And in fact, if you talk to people in the southern hemisphere, it's not fair. But it's a representation. And those representations are what people now, when we think about political campaigns, metaphor, story, and the way that we use language is important. Now, I heard a couple people say shit at the breakfast table, so I'm not going to feel too guilty when I tell you that for me, the greatest linguistic mind of the 21st century, or the 20th century, I should say, you can have Noam Chomsky, love him. You have Steven Pinker, love him, man, hate him. But George Carlin, for me, was the greatest insightful mind on linguistics. And when we think about the way that we use language now, if I talk about desktop or portal or window, this is none of those things. I'm using familiar constructs to explain things I don't understand. And we use the internet all day long like we use the streets all day long, but that doesn't mean we know them. And the internet, I get a huge kick out of it when people say, well, so what is open source learning? Like it's a noun, like it's a thing. And they say the same thing about the internet, right? It's an article that modifies the noun. I used to teach English. The internet is not a thing. It's a series of philosophical agreements about the way we communicate. And that's why people who were around when the well started, if anybody here knows what I mean when I say the well, it was the oldest continuous operating community. That's very different than big tech today. The open source community, the Fediverse, there's this beautiful pocket of the internet. You've heard of the dark web, I have no doubt you know what that is. But the Fediverse, for everything that you look at and go, man, you know what, YouTube's algorithms are making things more extreme and my kid's watching some Nazi video where he was just watching cartoons, how did that happen? Well, there's PeerTube. There's equivalents of these things. But the internet is not static, and neither are we. So when we talk about the hero's journey, I put this on the left. You probably know something about the monomyth. It still bends my mind to think about the fact that at a time when civilizations didn't even know of one another's existence, they were all sharing the same story. And it's Star Wars. Then there's the outside world. We have this in common too. This is not a filtered photograph. This is a photograph of my backyard 2 days before the hurricane in Palm Springs, California. I say, hey, the sky is pink. And someone goes, you're out of your mind. Okay, be that way, but it's pink. We've made a controversy out of everything, and the world is not that hard, as it turns out. You don't like gravity? That's fine. You get one chance to be a legend and prove us all wrong. Now, I can't say that in middle school classrooms, but I can tell you guys that. Please don't do this. I'd hate to be the first person at Dent who caused someone to go, yeah, you know what? Gravity sucks. But the reason I put this slide up is because I heard a lot of people during the pandemic say that people weren't learning. Absolutely false. We're learning all the time. Learning is sense-making. It's meaning-making. How many people learned words that they didn't know before? Coronavirus. Epidemiology. That's a fun one. Nobody knew that stuff. Now, a lot of people learned just enough to talk a bunch of nonsense and have a little bit of evidence to support it. But that's also a form of learning. We still have to navigate that environment. Now, let's get to some of the fun stuff. This is not an actual Time magazine cover. I gave a talk at the Institute for the Future 100 years ago, and they mocked this up for me. It's a little depressing because they put 2020 on it, so now I'm like 3 years behind. But when I started teaching, I realized nobody, you mentioned focus earlier, nobody was talking about focus. How many teachers told me to pay attention when I was a kid? All of them. What currency did they tell me to shell out? Nobody. So I started reading research when I taught about mindfulness. Didn't know much about meditation. I started telling some of you how I wound up teaching longer than I thought. And that was because in the environment where I was teaching, the largest urban high school in Los Angeles, with a lot of crime, a kid walked in with The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama. And I instantly dropped all pretense, where did you come from? He had forged his parents' signatures on the paperwork and called them from the airport in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to tell them he was getting on the plane for California, which is how he wound up in that warehouse instead of one of the brochure schools. Then he invited me home for dinner. 18 months later, after learning English, passing all of his classes, and graduating, he said, why don't you come visit in Mongolia? And I went, that's absolutely what I should do. So for a month, I was in Mongolia, Tibet, and Western China with this kid and his family, which is how I learned, for example, that the word for teacher in Mandarin is Lao Shu, the guy who wrote the Tao. Lao Shu Sao An is good morning, teacher. Now, I mention all of this because until I went to Tibet, I thought, I watched Kung Fu when I was a kid. I thought I understood Eastern philosophy. I thought I understood meditation. I know what I was talking about. It improves cognition. It lowers blood pressure. It has all of these remarkable things, and yet you can't tell people that. You just have to do it. So indulge me for literally 60 seconds. If you have anything in your hands, take it out of your hands. In fact, just to warm up, flex your fingers and work your fingers out a little bit, and then put your hands together in a way that they interlock, and notice which index finger goes on top. Most of us have a natural inclination toward one or the other. Just note if it's the right or the left. Now, take your hands apart again. Stretch out your fingers. And this time, put them together just as quickly, but with the other index finger on top. You said gross? It seems like it should be an easy thing to do, no?
Yeah.
Like all of our habits, though, we build those neural networks, and some things are easier than others. That's why, people talk about brain health as we age, and people say, brush your teeth with the other hand, take a different way home, because it's restoring some of that neural architecture. What I'd like you to do for a moment, you can do this with eyes open or eyes closed, is just sit, put your hands on your thighs, or you can put them together if you're more comfortable. Feel your feet. Feel your toes making contact with your footwear. Feel your butt making contact with the seat. And don't try to not have thoughts. But as thoughts come up, think of them as dandelions on a breeze, leaves floating down a stream, maybe a slideshow. If something comes up that you've been noodling on that's attractive to you for some reason, entertain it. If it's taking up space that you'd rather it not, watch it go. Every single time, come back to your breathing and listen to your inhale and listen to your exhale. And let's just be with that for another few seconds. Now, you're welcome to stay in that space. But when you're ready, if you're willing, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a word about how you're feeling now compared to how you were before we started. Centered. Present. Soothing. Ah, lovely. Impatient. Honest. I love that. So let's get on with it.
How long will that take?
Right. Now, I don't normally do this for more than a minute with anybody. I'm the same way. But in 1 minute, for no cost, anywhere you are in the world, even if someone's talking to you, I can go there in my head if I feel like it, because education only gets us from the neck down. The neck up is up to us. We feel better and more focused and more likely to understand what we're experiencing and more likely to remember it. Now, when it comes to the physical self, PE, disaster. There's more horrifying stories of people healing from their trauma from PE than there are people who said, oh, that's where I learned to get in shape. Not just exercise, but also rest and awareness of things like how we breathe. Does anyone know what a physiological sigh is? Oh, this is going to be a fun one. If you take nothing else away from today, this is going to be great for you. The next time you're stressed, breathe in, and then breathe in a little bit more. Not, you were too impatient. Blowing it out forcefully, you can, I just did that and I know this stuff and yet I still feel it. Now, how we rest, how we breathe, how we eat. I didn't know how to eat until I was in my 30s. And look, I'm nobody to talk about physical conditioning because when I wrote my first book, I just ran across it and I looked at the back cover. I'm looking at baby Huey version of me. I'm like twice of me back then. Why? Because I ate the same way I did in school, only I wasn't an athlete anymore. Nobody taught me that. But there's a $12 billion self-help industry waiting for us because we don't get to master these things early on. And my point in bringing this stuff up is that open source learning is not just about learning how to be a better widget in a corporate cog. It's about being a human being. To my humble way of thinking, that's what all learning should be. So we just talked about mental fitness. Now we're talking about physical fitness. Oh, and I went from baby Huey to actually having to do stuff that my students dared me to do, and I did my first Ironman in December. Yeah, that was my one look at me moment of this whole thing. It's one of 5 fitnesses, mental fitness. 1 of 5, physical fitness. Civic fitness is the 3rd. I'm not just talking about volunteering or voting, although those are certainly important, but what about things like managing my own resources? Whether that's taking care of my clothes or my checkbook. Do people even have checkbooks anymore? I feel my age every single time I hand my credit card to someone and they look at me like. But stewardship and collaboration of something larger than ourselves is not just innate. It has to be taught. We used to call it social studies. It's not doing that job anymore. So how we work with each other, I mean, when we talk about team building, that's a great question to ask because you're talking about people who I have almost an infinite amount of patience with kids. Anybody over 30? I try, but it takes an effort. Because by that point, we all think we ought to know better, and we don't. Now, if I mention spiritual connection, and I have a quote, people automatically think religion, that's one form of structured spiritualism, but anytime you look out at the mountains, the ocean, anything bigger than yourself that you don't understand, that counts. And I ran across this lovely quote from Carl Sagan. Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it's a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light years and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility, combined, is surely spiritual. So are our emotions in the presence of great art or music or literature, or acts of exemplary, selfless courage such as those of Mohandas Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both. There is a huge benefit to understanding people who break themselves before something larger. Not to, we hope, the detriment of other people, but certainly in service to something greater than themselves. This is also a good opportunity to talk about our relationship with things unseen. Now, I'm not talking mysticism, I'm talking curiosity. Every classroom has these great messages, right? Go boldly in the direction of your dreams, says Thoreau. Life is a daring adventure or nothing. You've seen the Successories posters, right? This is not unfamiliar territory. Meanwhile, what's going on in those rooms with those posters? People sitting like this. Life is a daring adventure or nothing. Life is nothing. Except that we have this catch-22 relationship with curiosity, because culturally, we don't want people to be curious. I think about the Manhattan Project, and I think about the edges of our understanding, and then the ethical implications of all of that, and what that must have done to so many people. I can't wait to learn from you. But, so we have all of this going on, but what's the implicit message? Curiosity did what to the cat? Don't fly how close to the sun? And oh, by the way, speaking of religion, the Abrahamic religions, right? We're talking about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. How'd that tree of knowledge thing work out? And that's what generation upon generation is brought up on. So yeah, be curious, but only in a way we can control. Oh, one more thing. If we're going to talk about the greatest teachers of history, who comes to mind? Socrates. I mentioned Lao Tzu. Confucius. Jesus. All different people, different eras, different cultures, but you know what they had in common? Really bad career endings. I'll let that one sink in. All right, so technological fitness. How in the world is the internet over 50 years old and we can't define it, we can't take it apart or put it back together, we don't understand packet switching? How many of you know TCP/IP? 1, 2. And this is like off the charts, smart, hard science driven, cool people conference. That's not a great batting average. And we graduate generation after generation without teaching any of this stuff.
You say that, you say the fact that people don't know TCP/IP, like TCP/IP, like it's negative, it's a positive. If you have to think of all the details involved in getting a packet from point A to point B, you are way too busy to write an email.
We agree. But the reason I pointed that out is because when you say, what is the internet? And people don't even know where inter and net come from, that it was a network over here and a network over here, and we had to help them talk to each other, and it's the spaces in between that is the internet. That's the level of understanding I'm complaining about. So let's come back to some brass tacks. You said you're impatient. Now I'm feeling concerned. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this except to allude to this. And I took this picture years and years ago in Albuquerque. The history of culture of school is people sitting in rooms just like this, looking at one person doing the talking who gets to stand, and it doesn't work for anything. It may have worked once upon a time. I mean, we're not even doing like the Plato's Academy thing. And the brief history of school, Dark Ages, plague, Charlemagne looks around and says, we got to teach the young people how to defend the country and have a business, or we're not going to have a country or a business, so let's do those things. And then that led into the idea of school being a function of business, commerce, and militarism, which got us to Prussia, which got Horace Mann to go visit, which got American publication, and this is where we are. In a nutshell, if you look at even the things like IQ testing, Alfred Binet in Paris made a quiz so that he could help kids who weren't succeeding in school. And the one thing he said above all was, please, whatever you do, don't try and use this to measure someone's intelligence. It wasn't until Lewis Terman and Stanford University, your alma mater, got a hold of this stuff and then started using it to exclude people from the military, from the Northeastern private universities. Bless you. I'm allergic to that kind of thinking too. The design of school has not changed, and that's why open source learning is like the Buddhism of learning. You can do open source learning in a conference like Dent, but you can also do it in a very strict schooling environment. We used to call it study groups, but now we've got the technology to support it. School's current value proposition, this is my daughter when she was tiny. And I was looking at her one day and I realized, oh my gosh. So she was stomping around puddles. And I started thinking about all of the different things I was looking at. Cute kids stomping around in puddle, yes. Wave mechanics in water, weather cycles and precipitation. The myth of Narcissus staring at herself in the reflection. It was so much going on there that I started thinking about, why are we writing curriculum for anyone anymore? Which is why, if you notice on that online community that we started, I kept asking people, like, what do you want to learn? And it wasn't because I was trying to get out of doing my job. It was because building with people, in my limited experience of being alive and on this planet, is way superior to building for people. There is no way that I could be in my integrity and tell you that I knew exactly what you would need out of this morning without ever having met you. Any more than any teacher in any classroom could ever do that. Now, do we have some curriculum that people who are doing licensing for a profession? Look, I flew here. I really hope that pilot passed a certain specific test and demonstrated that kind of knowledge. But American Airlines doesn't need college for that anymore. So, what's in a name? I talked about the open system. I talked about the interdisciplinary stuff, but we're going to go through this because this is the definition and each one of these has a point to it. I took this picture out of the back seat of a Piper Tri-Pacer airplane that was being flown by a 16-year-old. And if you don't think that wasn't a pucker moment, I have the links on this, and I'll be posting this whole thing so you can see the whole story. It's also the introduction to my book, shameless plug, that's going to be sold in the foyer at some point. But that was an English class. And Matt was just sitting there day after day, not misbehaving, not causing a fight or anything. But I finally said, why aren't you more here? Because I want to be a pilot, and the only thing for me to do right now is get out of high school. That's a really fair point. Why are you listening to me? We need to find you a pilot. And we did at Lompoc Airport. And 3 months later, I was in the backseat of that plane. Now, the call to adventure takes a lot of different form. When I teach, I usually put this up and I ask, here's what open source learning is, here's how we do it, is this something that's interesting? And then I do something that, according to the California Department of Education Code of Conduct, is technically illegal, but I would leave. Because I didn't want my being in the room, if you know your quantum mechanics, I didn't want to influence the observation and influence the dynamic. So I would walk out, and they would have to decide unanimously. Now, if you've done any sort of decision-making trees or analysis, you know that unanimous decision-making is the hardest thing in the world. If I said, hey, I'm getting this all free pizza for lunch, we just got to agree on the toppings. I'm not paying for lunch. It's not going to happen, at least not by lunchtime, because one of you will be the kind facilitative type who will say, you know what, I'll just pick off the anchovies, it's fine. That's not unanimous. Unanimous doesn't just mean having the same opinion. It means having the same opinion with the same degree of enthusiasm. Otherwise, you're looking at sabotage, even if it's by inaction. The best way for someone to steal from a company is not to say completely what's on their mind. So, and this is a video that students created, and you can watch this more at your leisure. I promise you it's entertaining. How did you pick who taught you? Did anybody ever actually seek out a mentor? Yeah?
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
I wanted to do something. The first one, actually used to live here in Santa Fe. I wanted to write and perform a one-woman show. She was a person that specialized in that, so I'm out here to work with her for 4 days.
I am instantly so wanting this to be a couple hours longer because I want to hear that whole story. That's amazing. And did you produce the show? That's awesome. Was there any, besides the fact that she had the experience that you were looking for, were there any particular qualities that helped you learn from this person?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is I haven't ever met anybody that had a career path that I was interested in. After I decided that I didn't want to be an actor and I couldn't be a singer-songwriter because my voice stopped working without pain, so I was looking for somebody that did something that I felt like I could do that.
That's awesome. So I guess the first quality is they exist. The beautiful thing is, I forget the number, some of you might know this, but this thing has 100 and something times the computing power of the first Apollo mission. Yeah, is it? Okay. My stuff's out of date. I used to talk about how, when I made Xerox copies for kids, because in 1980, 1 gig of memory that nobody would buy today cost $300,000. So I know it's changed since then. But look, I picked up my phone. I just got a message from Israel. Of course I did. Everybody's a mentor. Everybody in this room has something to teach me. And by the way, I am so freaking greedy. I'm going to wring you out like sponges during this conference because that's why I'm here. I love to learn. It's my one addiction. And actually, I don't think it's self-destructive, but as you get to know me, maybe you can give me some feedback. But it kills me. Sorry, another aside. When I was a kid, I had a babysitter, Edith. Edith delivered newspapers, and somehow my parents got to know her and thought she would be a great person to be a babysitter. And she was. She was awesome. But she, at the time, was in her late 50s, early 60s, I think. And everything that I did that she didn't like, she was going to shoot me. I am going to shoot you. Now, today, that sounds horrible. In 1974, 1975, it didn't sound horrible because it was ridiculous. It was Edith. I'm going to kill you if you do that. Nobody's going to do that. That's why it sounded that way. Now, I just heard myself say, it kills me when, I shouldn't say that anymore. It really frustrates me, though, when I hear someone who doesn't have that awareness because whatever gift that you had that made you go, you know what, somebody's done this. I wonder if I can find someone who's done this and start a conversation. That is the gateway to mentorship. And it is amazing. So one of the things that we practice in open source learning is finding a mentor. And no matter what I'm teaching, I'm likely not the best source. Out of all of the different things that you want to learn in this room, I've got 2 things that I can gift you. 1, a way to go about curating that and taking the steps in your journey that are going to make value even out of your mistakes or your false starts or whatever. But the second thing is, I have a wonderful network of people. It's like the same comedian I talked about the fireplace. He says, maybe you've seen my collection of seashells. I keep them on beaches, strewn all over the world. Same thing with my network and the internet. If there's somebody that's out there that I don't yet know, time to make friends. That network is everything, and it has a macrocosmic and a microcosmic parallel. How come you're late? Why have you not been here? I've missed you.
I was the volunteer checking people in, and they just stopped flooding in, so.
Thank you for everything you were doing. Give her a hand, yes.
You in.
And now our network has grown. When people think about the digital network, they're not looking at it like this is a representation of it, and I fell in love with that image. But this is what this room mentally is right now and could be looking like if we had more time and more interactive space. I almost messed up the seating arrangement when you got here just because I can't stand rows. But again, all of that's fungible. All of that's changeable. So if you're thinking something now that you weren't before you walked into this room, good, it's working. But it was going to happen that way anyway because all of you were so thoughtful that you're going to be thinking one way or the other. What you're thinking about is going to be like that old English assignment that you got when one person looked at it, scrawled something about your unclear thesis sentence, and then put a number or a letter on it. You got it back, valued it accordingly, shoved it in your binder or your backpack where it was crumpled and eventually lost to history like it never even happened. Unless we share it. That giving of ourselves is actually a very generous act. And some of the things I'm saying, I know how they sound. It sounds like greeting card stuff. I can imagine somebody like, well, duh. I mean, that's like, okay. I heard him say reflective listening. I heard him say reciprocity. He's going to go Carl Rogers on us, isn't he? Well, because it works. So even if you are an attorney and you're in a position-based bargain with a win or a loss and you're not looking to sustain a relationship through an adversarial outcome, what are you doing? And just stopping for a moment and asking those kinds of questions and then thinking about who are the people in our neighborhood. I've seen this time and again give us what we're looking for in other places of our lives. And what I mean by that is people seek pleasure and avoid pain. We're not that damn complicated. So for all the things that give us stress, the anesthetic is out there. When I got here last night, everybody was talking in an abnormally loud voice. Why? Because it was almost midnight on a Saturday night in Santa Fe, and it had clearly been a full evening for lots of people. These are actual young people in actual courses. Yes, that young man is writing an essay underwater because he wanted to. Another one is upside down on a roller coaster at Magic Mountain. That's me giving a talk to the Digital Media and Learning Conference of the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. But if you notice, I'm staring at a screen instead of at my audience because those are students of mine from all over the world on multiple screens, and we were having a panel discussion about their learning. I really enjoy being a conduit for those kinds of experiences. As a consultant, I like to say my clients tend to have really good ideas. Sometimes I'm nearby. That's about as good as it gets. But if you've ever done something simple, even solving a puzzle, doing a word game, figuring out a machine, that moment of, I did it, or even remembering something that was on the tip of your tongue. The problem with a lot of structured learning, not all of it, but the problem with a lot of structured learning is it doesn't teach us what success feels like. That happiness thing you were talking about, it teaches us to want more. Dopamine is a very powerful neurotransmitter, but dopamine isn't the thing that we thought we were getting. It's the practice of feeling like we want to get it. So all of those aspirational messages that people get through school about graduation and all that, that's just helping them in the training school of want for the next level. Now I got this, what's the next thing? And it's a never-ending process when you look at it that way. So we talked about big questions. Here's the thing about big questions. They actually don't have to be that big. They can be really personal, intimate. They are all interdisciplinary. Another really good reason not to write curriculum anymore is because no matter what you would tell me when you said whatever it was you were going to answer to what's the big question, I can link that to every A through G requirement for university admission if I feel like it. There isn't a single question that you could ask me, and I dare you to try, that I can't link to every academic tradition that we have. So if you're asking, why doesn't my boyfriend love me anymore? We've got biology, we've got probability, we've got, I think besides death, love is the biggest inspiration for all fine arts. But it goes on and on. I could give you an example about where will we get the energy in the future, or even, what does it mean to be an educated American in the 21st century? I think that is open to a lot of rich conversation that I would love to have as we go along in the conference. Now, I'm mindful of the time, which is why I'm going fairly quickly. Again, these are real slides from real people. We were having an in-class conversation with a few people who were very active on the internet. I didn't know this guy, but then somebody sent me an email saying, hey, do you know that your class was on some TED Talk in Malta? And I was like, of course we were. What? And he sent me that slide. And then I got to know Alex. To me, that's the way the world should work. We have all of these nodes of affinity, all of these interests in common. I was part of a working group that put together an open source suite of software. There's open source software that does everything that you like to do on your computer, only better. The knitting it together into a suite of stuff is a complicated thing, but to do this in open source software would be the technological equivalent. I talk about communities of support and critique, and that was why I put that slide up. Community is essential, and it's not always for mentorship. It can be, but sometimes you just need the pat on the back, or the kick in the butt. And sometimes you just need somebody who says, I see you. That looked like a really tough thing to try. I don't want to overlook that, which is why I spent another moment, because what tends to happen, so I mentioned the kid who became a pilot. This young woman was sitting in class one day and talking about her love for Yosemite and her desire to be an engineer but do things in an environmentally sustainable way. And she said, but you know what, I can't really tell you about Yosemite. She's talking to the whole class at this point. I said, well, Melissa, what is it that you're trying to, she said, you know what, you just got to be there. We should go. And I hate field trips. I haven't been in the classroom for years now. But during the pandemic, with all this, we're losing, my kids didn't notice a difference. Because we were already on the internet, we were already meeting online. And by the way, most of my students were children of undocumented farm laborers, and we're not talking about, remarkable, affluent, white AP kids. We're talking about everybody. She took us to Yosemite on a family trip. The principal called me a day before. Are you out of your mind? There's a trip. What about the liability? But what about the buses? I was like, there's no school trip. She's having a family weekend and invited a few of us along. My daughter went. We learned a lot about a lot of things, and I'll save my war stories there. So, the thinker. Does anybody know this as the poet? This is originally part of a massive sculpture that Rodin did for a Paris museum that was eventually never built, but it was from Dante's Inferno. And it was all of the agonizing figures in hell, including this one. And people don't know if it was the artist styling it after himself or fashioning it after Dante Alighieri, but there's more to everything than meets the eye. And part of what I'm getting at with that is that what we do next is going to make this meaningful or not. And I aimed to do this first part in about an hour, and I almost got there. We think of learning as for an outcome, for a goal. I want to achieve that with my team. I want to transform this industry. I want to get to a happy place. It's not about any of those things. And it's not some Hallmark card or bumper sticker about the journey or the destination either. It's just what we do. It's what we're geared for. It's what we're hardwired for. The trick is to do it mindfully so that every moment of every day we can tune into that channel. I'm not suggesting we try and do all of this consciously all the time, but that it's there for us so that when I'm thinking about the color blue, that I go back through my, oh, you know what? That was from the color, that was from a cyanide thing, and that was from, so that was like used to kill people, and it was part of a train car paint job, and I'm saying all of this stuff so that I can bookmark it later and put up links for you to know that there's actually a story around the color blue, and there's a quest for the perfect blue. It's a thing. Everything's a thing, and nothing's a thing. So on the one hand, you can go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole and make it all interdisciplinary all the time, which enriches everything that we do. So I'm thinking impatient. What do you want to solve? If there was one problem that you just wanted to get to it, whether it's at work, are you willing to like give us an example? Go for it.
Solving something. I think for me, I'm a really down-to-earth person. I don't have kids. I have a lot of time. I want to spend time doing things that bring me joy and helping other people. So I'm a recruiter professionally. So I'm an independent contractor, so I can take on as much work as I want, so I don't get burned out. But I also feel like I could be making more of a difference, not because I want to start my own business, because I don't want to take on too much. I want to enjoy my life, but I feel like I need to have more of a purpose and have more of a direction to be able to put my time to better use, rather than, you can go on the internet and you can research things, but you can't find really what you're looking for. So to be able to get information easier, to be able to make a difference, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That sounds wonderful. I love that. As soon as you said I have a lot of time, there was a piece of me that was just a smart ass. What's it like? It sounds delightful.
That's why I'm impatient when I'm calm and sitting there, because I have more energy around people that have energy, because I'm calm. So I get more energy. So when I have to sit there and force myself, it takes my energy because I get anxious.
Yeah.
So.
That makes a lot of sense now that you're saying a little bit more about that. A lot of anxiety, a lot of nerves. I mean, it's like energy with nowhere to go, right? And yeah, I felt that. So here's the idea. In our next little while, oh look, she's famous. In our next little while, what I'd like to do is give us a chance to play. So this next 10 minutes is yours. What will you do with it? You can reconnect with someone that you started a conversation with, or you can reconnect or, it's all a yes and, you can reconnect with our online community and post something that's on your mind while this session is going on. You can publish that post. You can respond to somebody else's post if you haven't been on the community or you didn't give it a look before the conference started. You can ask anybody anything, me or anybody else around you. You can answer anything that you hear, whether it's in your conversation or not. I strongly encourage us, there's a paper that I read a while back about information width. And one of the things that I practice in open source learning is that we have really elegant structures for siloing information. In school, it's the classroom. In the organization, it's the department model. Well, what happens when you blur those boundaries and when you take down some of those barriers are really interesting conversations. So if you hear something out of your peripheral listening, is peripheral listening a thing? I just made that up. Feel free to jump in and contribute. Curate. I love the fact that so many of us were trained on taking notes but told not to doodle. It was wrong-headed thinking. I understand why. It's do as I say, but it's not the thing that's going to help people think. When I say curate, yeah, you can go on our community and put up anything you like, but you can also draw. You can write something to yourself. You can put something, a totem in your backpack, whatever. All of this, even what you're doing right now, is practice. One quick thing as you listen to each other. The difference between hearing and listening, here, I'll do this the way I used to do it in class. What was that about? Anger? Any other guesses? Who's killing a fly? Anybody else? Mad at his portfolio? Getting our attention? Okay. The honest answer is, I don't know. I was just creating a vibration in the air to illustrate a point. Because if you have a working hammer and anvil, the small bones in your ear, and you can process that vibration, you can't help but hear stuff. Listening is a whole nother animal. We could spend 3 hours just on listening alone, because what we do with hearing and bringing our presence and our brain to the listening process, that's an art. And by the way, so Barbara, I was talking with this morning, and you said that you wanted to think about teaching as you do workshops. there's an article I'm going to give you, and it's about the art of teaching, but the science and the craft of teaching. The science is all the research. It's all the stuff that we know about neurology and cognition and processing. The craft is the fun part. That's the doing this stuff and seeing how it works. And the art is taking those experiences and imagining what might apply to the next group of people, because, oh, by the way, this is the first time that this group of people has ever been assembled. You are witnessing a first in human history. So for me to think that what I did last week is going to apply, or that what I'm doing now is going to work in a particular way with the next group of people, or even when Evan's in a different mood in 5 minutes, your mileage may vary. So whatever you do, have fun. Before I start the clock and give us 10 minutes, does anybody have any questions, comments, jokes, riddles, anecdotes? Smart Alex? Yeah.
One thing that, because I've spent a lot of time on the Manhattan Project, and you're all have seen the movie, but one of the things that happens right at the beginning is General Groves comes in and says, okay, information, we're going to put it in silos, and they will not be connected. And Oppenheimer said, not at all, no way. We have, and what they ended up with was on Tuesday mornings at 7 o'clock, everybody could come. Anybody could ask anything. Anybody who had a good idea, really good, you want $5,000, you go down the canyon, see if you can blow it up, whatever. But that was at the initial setup for the project, was it with all information, there was almost no hierarchical status, a good idea.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us.
That's another question.
You know, the Medici family had a pretty good handle on this, right? You've probably heard of the Medici effect. It was a well-known book that came out of Harvard research. The idea that you can have people around the table looking at the same issue or problem or opportunity from different perspectives was literally enriching. It created the juice for the Renaissance. When we look at things now, and there's some wonder, like, I don't know about the singularity, but I do want to help move us toward the interdisciplinarity. Because when I think about, there's these wonderful examples of architects solving cancer problems because they were looking at the structure of the cell and they realized the vulnerability and what would compromise the structural integrity. I love that kind of stuff. That's like poetry to me. So as you're thinking about these things, thank you for bringing that up, but let's see if we can tackle something from multiple perspectives. And then if there's anything that's really like, hey, you know what came up in our conversation? When we come back in 10 minutes, we'll wrap up together and talk about how we then take these things with us. Because this is a sneaky, insidious topic. There's part of this where I can imagine someone coming in and going, yeah, that's stuff I already did. Cool. But was it stuff that you were already consciously talking about, reinforcing, repeating, and growing? I don't know. That's what I want to magnify and move from this session into the rest of the conference, because I got a sneaking suspicion it's going to make the rest of the conference and our online conversations about the rest of the conference so much better. We're not all going to be going to the same things at 2 o'clock. And if we're curating about those things, I get a window into Barbara's experience and Ward's experience and maybe a workshop that I didn't get to. And Evan, I don't know why, but you're the kind of thinker that I just can't wait to get to know, because the way you look at stuff already has me thinking. So 10 minutes, anything on the menu or anything you can invent, and then let's come back and share, and I'm just going to kind of meander around and listen in. That's all the structure you're going to get. Do something. God, I thought I was never going to end. Justin.
Well, I just overheard a little bit of conversation, but the part that I'm pulling into mind is creating situations that have a low barrier to entry is beneficial to a larger number of people. So that's something I hadn't thought of, or something I thought of, but it just popped out of this conversation here.
That's great. And I'm going to pick on everybody, so you don't have to be ready right away. But Brandon, what are you thinking? I was just wondering what came up for you in the last 10 minutes. What'd you learn or what'd you think about?
It was interesting. We ended up we started talking just to get to know each other, and then very quickly ended up in a conversation around socio-political dynamics and oppression and policy and systems and how they work and don't work for certain people. And yeah, it went in a very interesting direction for
Wow.
It was interesting to see that I don't think either one of us intended to go there, but just some life circumstances and things we've been seeing over the past few months took us there.
And if it's okay, I'll continue because reaching the paradox of to make a social contract that works, we have to break down an existing social contract, which builds up the idea that a social contract isn't an important thing, and yet the whole point of breaking down the social contract is to create a better one.
Yeah.
And you know how we wrap our heads around that, and more importantly, how we communicate that head wrapping, you know, for other people.
Yeah. Such an important conversation. If you talk about Rousseau, or if you talk about the parent who says to their kid, well, I know Mrs. Johnson's a headache, but you know what, this is part of the rite of passage. Just get your diploma and your life will be at least as good as ours. We have all sorts of social understandings that now no longer seem to be validated by people's experience of it. And what do you do then? So it's not necessarily the idea that agreement is bad. It's not necessarily that contracts are wrong, but renegotiating and re-understanding in light of that was kind of why I put up that physical reality thing, because if we can't acknowledge that times have changed. When I was a kid, we went to school for the good stuff. That was where they had the film strips. That was the best technology got. All right, so thank you for that. So we have low barriers to entry, and then we have oppression. I don't remember anyone during the pandemic saying, my God, I miss raising my hand to go to the bathroom. But you're right. And when I said veal for the rodeo, in school, it's keep your eyes on your own paper, do your own work, speak when you're spoken to and given permission. At work, why can't you be a better team player? Why don't you communicate? All right. And I'm tempted to riff on all these, but please, more. Yes?
I saw a ton of listening, and it's so interesting because it's something else tried to do better, but I don't think we don't do good at it because we don't want to. And I just saw a whole bunch of people who want to do eye contact, nodding, and leaning in. It was just fun to watch.
Yeah, for sure. Mackenzie, what was one thing you got?
Our conversation started about trying to understand why the cost of healthcare in the United States is so expensive as opposed to other countries, and what sets the base standard or value of what is the justification for that. She brought up this question, and then what was interesting is then we built it around the conversation about cost in general and how you can validate costs or shift based on what people can afford, and we all actually had a really interesting take on it. And so my big takeaway is, even though I don't know much about healthcare, by us all having these different perspectives, we were able to learn a lot.
Oh, it's brilliant. Thank you for that. You got me thinking. Anybody else from that back corner before I move over here?
What my takeaway was, it was kind of a reminder, revisiting the fact that when for my company, we set a very low price point because we want to open it to everyone, and yet there's still people who can't afford it, and it's a win-win. That's where I learned that it really is a win to us to make it free, just to not say no to anybody.
Yeah.
It's a win for us also. That's great.
What a beautiful way to look at it. I worked with the director of the Center for Evolutionary Biology at UCLA for a while. William Schopp was his name. And Bill taught me a lot of, we think of evolution as a gradual progression through adaptation, and it's not. Evan's shaking his head at me, and you're right. It is dramatic, and we use the word disruption too much for my taste, but the water rises, your kids are growing gills or they're not going to make it. And when we think about some of the metaphor even around denting the future, these things are possible. In the same way that if I don't turn my head, that's hard. But when I turn my head, I can do it. That's ridiculous. I just modeled this for you. I can't really do that much of it's over here. But if I look, it is suddenly. That's bizarre until you do it and it's not. Thank you for that. Let's go on up to this corner. What's new and exciting for you?
We talked some about human design and different types of people and different energy systems, and how great conversations really thrive on that constellation of diversity. Different people, different perspectives. Arguing is nice.
Arguing is wonderful. Arguing, just to go on a slight riff about that, is a search for the truth with people who collaborate. Arguing does not have to be a win-lose adversarial conflict. In fact, my favorite arguments are those in which someone actually gets me thinking in a different way than when I started. So thank you for bringing that up. it also brings me to the point of entitlement and rights. If I have a right to something, that means you have an obligation to honor that right. If I can walk across the street safely in the crosswalk, you got to stop your car. Except that if we're in London and you're looking the wrong way and stepping off the curb, you're not going to be entitled for very long. So one of the things that comes up in my way of doing that part of life is, well, logic 101. What's factually verifiable in the world and true? And what can we say true about and mean that in a way that we share? And then how do we logically progress through, whether it's a syllogism or whether it's something more ornate, so that we can follow each other's reasoning and understand each other? Because it's not even about the argument. In fact, this session isn't even about these things. I love the idea that if Andreas or somebody sees you in the hall, any one of you, hey, what was that about? Oh, we talked about healthcare. We talked about oppression and barriers to entry. We talked about social contract. We talked about humans and listening. What the hell did you guys do in there for 2 hours? It's rich. Barbara and I talked a little bit about training law enforcement. And this is a good way to bring things to a moment so that we can think about how to export this. I gave a training for LAPD a long time ago, and as part of it, I did a ride-along. I was telling you guys a story earlier. And Super Cop says, oh, I'm just going to talk to this guy. Now, this was not too long after the Rodney King verdict and the riots, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm sitting in the passenger car of Profile 101, African-American walking along the street, police officer says, I just want to talk to him. Why? Well, sure enough, he pats him down and finds a gun and a speedball. Okay, Columbo, Super Cop, how'd you do it? Because at that point, I'm kind of in awe. And he says, well, I had a hunch. And I said, great, that's just great. So now I'm going to go talk to your rookie class and say, you guys should have a hunch. How do you have a hunch? What did you do? And it literally took us the better part of half an hour before he was able to dissect his observational technique and to describe the physiology of what he was seeing long enough to say, well, you know what, actually it was when he was moving his right arm back, it was like a little abnormally far, like he was checking something in his pocket. And I guess I didn't think of it that way. It just struck me as, I don't think he said asymmetrical, but that was the idea. Something was off. Everything that we do can be boiled down to that level. When we talk about building teams, if you talk about just the communication style that someone uses, and we talked about nonverbal communication, does anybody have a handle on how much meaning you get from what someone says? If meaning is 100%, what percent would you guess is caused by the words that I'm choosing to say to you right now? Any guesses? I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't setting you up for something, so take a guess. 20? Less than 50? Yeah, try about 5 plus or minus 2. Most of the meaning that we get from people is from our paraverbal and our nonverbal communication. Paraverbal is how I use my voice, how loud I speak, how fast I speak, whether I pause. That's a great way, by the way, the next time you're with the law enforcement group, just stop talking for a second and wait for somebody to go, oh, she's probably looking at me because I was dicking around on my phone. All of those things add up. And when you think about it logically, it makes sense. I love you. I love you! 2 very different things. Same words. Words are easy. Why bring all of that up? Because when we talk about learning, we're talking about all of those little micro moments, but it's not enough to leave this session going, oh, that was interesting, and then doing everything the same way that we were doing it before. It's like this business. So, what can we do differently? Well, first, if you remember a long way back around, I talked about trust. There's another part of that. That moment when you crinkled up the paper or made a rip in it didn't damn the paper to eternal relegation or not being a piece of paper anymore. It's just a different piece of paper. Does anybody know what this is? This is actually a Japanese art. Kintsugi. Yeah. It's the art of repair. And when something breaks in Japanese culture, if it's worthy, They take gold or silver dust and they make a paste out of it and they put it in the cracks, and it becomes something that now includes the story of its brokenness. If you know anything about martial arts and you watch, like Bruce Lee do his, thumb and forefinger push-up, or you watch these martial artists break stacks of cinder blocks, and you go, I could not do that without breaking something, you are absolutely correct. Because in order to get to that point where they're able to do this, they had to break themselves, literally. When you start doing that work, you create small fractures in your bone that then heal and knit back together more densely than they began. That bone that you're watching do that work is not the bone that you have in your hand unless you've been doing that work. So, just like almost every culture I can think of has some sort of dough and meat combination to it. You can do wontons, you can do raviolis, you can do khushur in Mongolia. There is some element of repair in every culture as well. We were talking about Judaism at breakfast. Tikkun olam is a beautiful example of that, right? Repairing the broken fragments of the world. Kintsugi is another. Well, at this point, all of our learning has been broken at some point. There's a wonderful little book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball by a guy named Gordon MacKenzie, who was an executive at Hallmark. And I think his title was Creative Enigma. And he tells a story about going to elementary schools because he was also a sculptor and he would make animals out of metal. And the assemblies all go the same way. Kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. And he would start the assembly by saying, all right, who here is an artist? Well, the kindergartners were out of their minds. Woo! Every grade got less and less, and we all know the reasons why. But it happens, it's undeniable. So somewhere living in you is a 5-year-old going, yeah, I heard what you said, Preston. Nah, why? Well, that's the part of you I want to wake back up, not for just the sake of being combative, but really being curious, passionately curious. Curious to the level that you're willing to try, look foolish, make mistakes, get up, dust yourself off, and do it again. And do it better. And find a mentor. And put things out there into the world that show us how you're learning. I have a lot of students, and I'm talking executives, I'm talking young people, who are confused about making mistakes. I don't think mistakes are good or bad, but they are. And when I look at somebody's longitudinal progress, their progress over time, they are so valuable to look at together, so that if I see someone's approach to delegation or conflict management in their organization or building teams from 6 years ago, and I go, yeah, that was adorable then, because you were looking at the Clue Train Manifesto and starting to get micro-marketing and building communities of affinity that then would help people learn about your product. But you didn't really get it when influencers hijacked CRM, and now your market isn't even your market. It's somebody on Insta. Who uses that word? I'm 53 years old. But when we talk about passionate curiosity and putting ourselves out there, it takes guts these days to do anything with any integrity and not feel like somebody's going to smack you down for something. Especially if it's as high stakes as your job. Or worse, and I'll put it that way, if, like a lot of teachers I talk to, if you are personally invested, if your identity is associated with what you do, then what does it say to make a mistake? We talked about think tanks at breakfast. What is a think tank except for putting ideas out there based on somebody's best guess combined with their research and saying, you know what, we could look at the world this way. What a wonderful invitation to an argument if it's a search for truth. So, if I go back to what we just did and we talk about this list, that's just the beginning. I would love if for the rest of this conference and the rest of whatever comes next, if you find yourself thinking, you know, this is kind of what we were talking about in that session with that guy, to put it somewhere that we can see it. Because all of the talks that we see are going to be wonderful. I'm already primed for wonderfulness from what I've seen so far at Dent. It's going to be even more wonderful if we are flavoring it by looking at it through all of these different lenses and then building bridges between each other, between the connecting with the information, between the people who are providing the information. That's what makes a real community. It's not agreement. Diversity is a feature and not a bug. And for me, diversity is all about divergent thinking. On that happy note, I want to ask you to have the last word. So, because I talked about the value of our time in the beginning of this, and we're almost to the level of noon, what didn't I get to that you wanted more of? What do you have questions about? What, if this were going to go on, would you want more of? Because, oh, by the way, the community is going to be my next step, and I'm going to be putting more of this stuff on there. And when I look at the video and remember all the things that I said on purpose that I knew I wouldn't remember without looking at the video, then I'll be curating all of those and adding more to this. But what's on your mind as we close?
I want to see if I can tee everyone up. My favorite part about having a sandbox that we can all go play in is this expansion and contraction of time. So you can expand it out, and a week from now have a great idea and come back and comment on that thing that happened today, and then you can condense it by those separate ideas all coming into one spot. It's just fun. So just throw that out.
Thanks. Now, Barbara and I were talking about law enforcement and how at the end of her talks they don't really give a rousing hand because they're too overwhelmed and wondering what it'll say about them that she just gave them the solution to their unsolved things. I'm not looking for an attaboy here, but I would love some feedback. So if it's not something that you want more of or you have a question about, what went well? What was horrible? What are you just thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this guy got away with a free Dent pass for this?
It reminded me so much of improv. I studied improv in school, and just the yes and of the storytelling, and then the way that you're bringing that into more of the science of learning and collaborative conversation is really cool. It feels like you just opened up a little mycelial doorway into another way of thinking about things that I personally experienced through doing improvisational storytelling in theater.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
It is so cool. People from the outside of improv often look and go, man, that's so weird. And people enter you've not experienced this.
Yeah, that's an experience.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think we all do it every time we have a conversation. We're improvising. It's not like you're thinking up exactly what you're going to say before you say it. So we're all improvising all the time. And I feel like you just gave us a map for defusing some of the triggers that keep us from just being present and authentic and collaborative in that way. To be fearless about sharing truth without needing it to be right.
That's awesome to hear. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, sure.
And fearless, absence of fear. I go with courage just because I feel afraid all the time. I just do this stuff anyway. And you mentioned improv. My daughter and I, judge me if you will, we're freaks. She wanted to read a bedtime story a few years ago, and we had just seen Les Mis, the play. And I said, it's based on a book, right? And she was like, show me. And I had the unabridged 1,200-page book, and she was like, yeah, we should read that. She's 14 now. We've been at it for 2.5 years, and we're on page 900 something. It's a ripping good read. But I had it with me because she was visiting, and we were together, and she decided that she wants to go to UCLA. And that's my alma mater. I never would have suggested it, but wow. So I took her to campus. We're checking into the hotel. I've got Les Mis, the big red book that I brought with us. I put it on the hotel registration desk to check in, and he says, wow, that's a big book. And I said, yeah, I keep a lot of words in it. And I don't know why I said that, but the next day we're at the beach and we're standing in about knee-deep surf. And I said, Tara, how many different ways can you think of to answer that question? We just decided to make it, I guess it was an improv thing. And my favorite, she looks at me deadpan. She's this cute, blonde, everything is right in that kid's world. And she looks at me and she goes, you see it too? I thought that would have been gold. All right, thank you for that one. And for putting a smile on my face with that memory. Anybody else? Any award?
Yeah, I do this, but I don't have a word for it. And I think you sort of opened me up to a struggle that I have. And professionally, I'm an early stage climate tech investor. So I have to become an expert in 20 different things.
Yeah.
And those 20 different things change every year. And it's incredibly exhausting and exhilarating. And the more I can be intentional about how I go about doing that, and broadening my learning beyond primary research to secondary research, or going to the library or talking to people, it's always talking to people that lights me up and gets me the really good information. So just creating more permission or a broader definition of learning is feels incredibly valuable. So thank you for that.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Does anyone remember Magic Johnson? Yeah, the player though, right? When I said that, you're not thinking, oh yeah, the famous Lakers coach who lasted 19 games and then left in a huff because nobody could do what he wanted them to do. But you do know Tommy Lasorda, right? The Dodgers manager. Now, Tommy Lasorda, his claim to fame, not as a pitcher, that's what he started off as, but never made it as a player. But as a coach, amazing. What was the difference between these two people? Well, it's not just the inverse correlation between performance and helping other people perform. It's that Magic, literally, I mean, talk about open source learning, literally didn't know what he was going to do when he came down the lane, which made him indefensible. And it was the pass, that way, it was the whole thing. But how do you teach somebody to have a hunch? Unless you have that analytical frame and that language so that you can replicate it and that you can help other people share in it. A big part of what and I never really thought of myself as a learning coach, but a big part of this process is giving names to things that people think of as second nature because they were never taught it. Well, that's the good stuff, because if you learned it and you enriched your life through learning it, well, that's substance, that's value. And just because we haven't labeled that and created a marketplace for it doesn't mean it's not essential. Evan.
It's worse than that. Because what anybody can do easily, they don't value.
Right.
And by the time you know, if you are a Magic Johnson, whatever you do, if you do it naturally and easily, your first assumption is that everyone can do it.
Yeah. And that was true for me as a kid when it came to learning, because I didn't like being taught. I took the LSAT and they actually threatened to kick me out because it was on an early Saturday morning, which meant that I had been out late the night before. And every time I fell asleep with my head back and I started to snore. But they wouldn't let you go on until they gave you permission for the next section. So my whole life I was confused, and I am really gratified, and I want to say thank you to each and every single one of you, because you made my day better. I'm looking at, like, the guy's a champion pizza maker. What are they coming here for? And you're right. When you see someone do a thing, you go, okay, well, I can't do an appendectomy. I can't invent, genetic research that's going to solve serial killers, and thank you for that, by the way. I'm easily impressed by what people do. But this is the fuel for all of that. And the reason that I've decided that this is the hill that I want to keep climbing up and up and up is because it also seems directly responsible for everything that could be reparable and improved upon in our world. I started doing this work in classrooms not too long after 9/11. And it really struck me. When I talk about social contracts and oppression and people feeling like they're completely discounted, I know it's the wrong Bradbury, but my grandmother almost married Ray because she sat next to him in class at Los Angeles High School. And for a long time, like a lot of people, I thought Fahrenheit 451 was about, firemen burning buildings and things being backward and cognitive dissonance. It's not. It's about learning. And it's about collaboration and finding meaning. And through that, finding ourselves. And on that, I'll say thanks and we're done. For now.
Is the pizza here yet?
No. What did you want on it?
Everything.
How could I argue with that answer? I really hope that we're just getting started, so please feel free to come back and play on the sandbox. Feel free to get a hold of me in any way you want. I will drop everything and have a conversation about this all the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.